All right, so here we go. We're going to start with the Red Scare, as this is part 2 of a 2-part video. So if you haven't got a chance to watch the other one, I would watch that one first and then this. So we're looking at the United States after World War I, and so we're going to look at the Red Scare. The communist. So basically the Red Scare was brought about by the fact that the Russians, the Bolsheviks, which were radical Russian communists, believed that the workers should own all the means of production. They should own the factories. They should control and share the profits that were coming from farms and from collective farms and from factories. And so the idea was that to overturn so that not a few people benefit from the work of many. So Communist Party, 70,000 out of 105 million. And all fair to the workers, the wages were not very high during this time, and wages didn't get up to a living wage until probably after World War II. And so workers wound up having a pretty meek existence, what we would consider poor. And so workers wanted to be able to purchase the things they were making, be able to feed their families, be able to live in a decent place, and so they have better working conditions. So the Communist Party, 70,000 out of 105 million. Okay, so what we're going to look at is, was the Red Scare really, truly proportionate, or the way they responded to the Red Scare, proportionate to the threat? There were 16 bombs in the mail, one that blew off a secretary for a judge, blew off his hand. So there was a lot of fear by that. There were May Day riots in Cleveland, New York City, and Boston. And May Day riots were basically workers on Labor Day going ahead and walking on parade routes, and these were interrupted by veterans and other patriotic groups that were also that felt like these basically marches were wrong, and that these people needed to be stopped, and so this created riots. Well, between the bombing and the riots, there was pretty swift reaction. So the government response, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who was, as the Attorney General, the head of the Justice Department, created the FBI. Hoover got $500,000 from Congress to keep files on radical leaders. Or he wanted to create the FBI, so he got money from Congress to be able to create this and watch and create files on radical leaders. The Justice Department, Mitchell Palmer was really thinking about running for an election for president. So he was thinking of himself, if he reacts strongly to this, that would look good if he ever ran for president. So the creation of the FBI. Palmer raids against foreign radicals, November 19th to January 20. And these were a series of raids by Justice Department officials of anyone suspected of being a communist. So on November 7th, 1919, the offices of Union of Russian Workers in 12 cities without warrants, they turned the immigrant radicals to be deported. And so they took over these places, took the rosters, and deported many of the leaders of these unions. They deported over 234 people. Just from this raid, there were more than 6,000 arrests in 30 American cities. Deprived of the First Amendment rights under the Espionage and Sedition Acts during World War I, they were extended during this time. Andre Salcedo in the FBI, he was found at the bottom of an FBI building. He had died, and the FBI said that he jumped out of the building, but there's a lot of evidence that would say that he had a little help leaving that building. And so one of the things here is that just the lack of rights that people had, that if they were called a communist or had communist leanings, that they really had very few rights. A lady by the name of Emma Goldman, who was born in the United States, a U.S. citizen, was part of the people deported by the U.S. Overall, 4,000 people were deported, and native-born radicals were prosecuted under recently passed laws, and then some of these citizens were deported to Russia, even though they had no connection with Russia besides their beliefs. On Armistice Day, 1919, the IWW, International Workers of the World, halls in Centralia, Tacoma, and Seattle, and Spokane were raided. And in one of these, the veterans of World War I grabbed one of the leaders of this group and executed him by hanging him and then hanging him upside down to form as a reason for why you should stay away, or for radicals to stay out of the United States, to stop drumming up strikes and other things that were causing the U.S. problems. Overall, over 4,000 people were deported, and native-born radicals were prosecuted under recently passed laws. This invasion of and suppressing of the basically the 10 Amendments, or the Bill of Rights, the ACLU was founded, and this group was founded during this time to protect the rights of American dissenters. That just because you go against the majority does not mean you should be prosecuted by the police or by the Justice Department, that you have rights and those rights need to be protected. So it's the American Civil Liberties Union. So what you see here is a Bolshevism, Eastern European guy slipping under the U.S. flag. His thing says anarchy or no order. This was the fear that if they continued to let radicals into the United States, they would continue to cause problems, like the 6,000 strikes, like the different May Day riots. That these are caused by radical beliefs, and that the strong pushing of Palmer and these others was what needed to happen in order to suppress this communist revolution. Often what happened here, though, was that you have to really question whether that was too far, whether they went too far. So the United States, or people in the United States, then believed, just like they did in Canada, that it was time to ban immigration. And so they, the Quota Act of 1921 was the first act that was passed. This wasn't a very effective act. It set quotas from people from different places in Europe. It definitely lowered the quota for anybody in Eastern Europe, because they considered those are the ones that are causing most of the problem. And then, so you have the nations needed to act immediately to prevent its shores from being overrun with refugees from war-torn Europe. The National Origins Act of 1924 is even more restrictive. The chief purpose of the act was to limit the numbers of less desirable immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and from Japan, many of them who have played a vital role in the nation's industrial development. And so the National Origins Act basically prevents people that could not become citizens from coming in, and it prevents most people from Eastern and Southern Europe, basically only kind of opening immigration to people of Northern European descent. Okay, the economy. The short term is that the U.S. economy experienced a downturn as the 1920 gross domestic product, which is a number that summarizes the amount of money the United States made. It went from $79 billion to $63 billion in 1922, which signifies that there is a recession. The history here is from 1880 to 1920, the U.S. economy completely industrialized and saw tremendous growth in every sector of the economy. 1914, the U.S. GNP fell, indicating the U.S. was heading into a recession. But during the war, an estimated $3.5 billion, and this amount the government borrowed some $23 billion, and raised some $10.5 billion through taxes. Business saw expansion and high profits during the wartime years, rise in manufacturing capital expenditure from $600 million in 1915 to $2.5 billion in 1918. The average corporate profits nearly tripled from 1914 to 1919. So the U.S., the economy was already booming, but was already growing, and the industrial base was there, and instead of slipping into a recession, the economy boomed. But the basis of that, the foundation of that, was all that money that was put in. And so you see that not only does industrialization grow, but the Herbert Hoover and the Food Administration increased food exports, increased from some 7 million tons to 18 million tons. Farmer income soared because of the Lever Act, set commodity prices high. Farm production increased from 30 to 40% as a result of expanded acreage and availability of farm machinery. But based on these kind of artificially high prices for their goods, farmers were expanding without really considering what was going to happen when those price controls were taken away. Short term, the U.S. economy experienced a short turn like I was talking about before. They dropped price controls, rationing, and all other government control of the economy immediately in 1918, which led to a short recession. End of wartime production led to layoffs. Soldiers was discharged from the Army without any type of transition program. In the United States, there were no veteran programs. 77% inflation led to strikes and other labor trouble that we've already talked about. So the long term, the U.S. economy saw large, unprecedented growth in industry. Protectionism, government passed tariffs to support the industrial growth. They passed tariffs that raised the price of raw materials and manufactured goods coming into the country to protect U.S. businesses so that people would rather buy from U.S. businesses. The average duty on all imports was 14%. Average on dutiable imports was 38.5%. The growth, examine the two charts and write down what you notice. Farmers failed to gain from the U.S. economic growth of the 1920s. So, we're not going to look at those charts right now. I will show those to you in class. But the farmers failed to gain from the U.S. economic growth of the 1920s because of the fact that they went into such a large recession afterwards. Okay, so social impact, and then we are done here. There's two major social impacts. One is the 14th Amendment of the Constitution gave free men the vote, but restricted the franchise to men, using the word male as qualifications for voting. This was a slap in the face of women who worked really hard to get the 14th Amendment passed and put into the Constitution. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? This was a group of women that were picketing outside the White House during World War I. This was considered unpatriotic, and some women were criticized for this, but they felt like the way they contributed to the war and what they did for the war meant that they needed to push for their right to vote now. You'll see that 14th and 15th National Women's Suffrage Association, Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony worked for the 14th and 15th Amendment, and they begin to want to work for the 20th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. I think it's the 19th Amendment. Let me check here. And so, basically, we get to the point where we're looking at women working really hard to make sure that they got their rights. The National Women's Temperance Movement and the Women's Congress both were working to get rid of alcohol, to create prohibition, but these organizations, at the same time they were doing efforts to try and lower drinking, they also were working towards women voting. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was this one right here, was a force behind the drive to permit women to vote in municipal elections, because those local elections often involved referenda determining whether liquor could be sold. And so they worked really hard to get the vote there because they knew that they could pass temperance if women were voting. The first Women's Rights Convention was held in 1848. And women got together and they tried 3 different strategies throughout time to try and get the vote. Some feminists suggested modified strategies for securing the vote, state by state, go for local elections. Women were considered those that were should be in charge of the kid and the education of the kid, and so it was essential. They basically said it was essential for mothers to have a voice in matters pertaining to education and schools. So they were going for what limited suffrage, which was called school suffrage. Michigan and Minnesota for women who were both widows and mothers of school children were given the vote. In 1898, tax-paying women in Louisiana were enfranchised on tax matters. Generally, Western states were more receptive to female suffrage, in part because they hoped women's influence would promote law and order. Because in the West, many of those states did not have kind of the rule of law as they did. So in 1915, Congress considered but did not pass a law to permit women to vote. So in 1917, Alice Paul organized a picket of the White House, for which she and many followers were arrested and imprisoned. Public outrage over these arrests was another significant factor in creating momentum for the drive to pass the suffrage amendment. So in 1910, women made up 18.3% of the labor force, age 16 and over, with 7 million out of 7 million women. Beginning in Wyoming in 1868, meaning that 7.7 million women were working. Successive territories and states gave women the right to vote, and women during the war entered the workforce. Congress considered a law. Alice Paul organized a picket of the White House to push Woodrow Wilson, who basically worked to pass the amendment, worked to pass it through every state. 2/3 of the states had to vote and to pass that, and they did that, and passed the Women's Right to Vote Amendment, which is the 19th Amendment that gives women the right to vote. All right, last thing we're going to talk about right here. This is a picture of the Great Migration. You can see plantations to cities. African Americans, because of the repression of the South, because of the lack of ability to raise up economically, they felt like going from places where they basically rented land by farming the land and gave away a lot of their money, but they were tenant farmers. They didn't have many rights by the law. They were often taken advantage of, and so they saw the chance of moving to cities, both in the South and the North, as a way of gaining economic independence. Between 1916 and 1918, almost 500,000 African Americans moved to the cities of the Northeast and Midwest to fill jobs and seeking social freedom. Because jobs opened up because of the demand for World War I, they worked in shipyards, steel mills, and meatpacking houses. The majority lived in rural areas, worked as tenant farmers. So let's go before the war. 1870, 78% of African Americans lived in the southern rural areas, worked as tenant farmers or in menial jobs. Lynching was common. De jure segregation in the South with Jim Crow laws after Plessy versus Ferguson, and de facto segregation in the North. De jure means by law. So in the South, there were Jim Crow laws that meant that blacks could not use the same facilities, same places, same restaurants, same movie theaters as whites, or they had to sit in the back of the movie theater, the back of the bus, could not use the same bathrooms. And this was created based on this Plessy versus Ferguson, was a Supreme Court case that ruled that that the law only required separate but equal, not integrated services. And so we know that separate means unequal, for African Americans, but that was the law that was passed at the time. De facto segregation in the North just means that whites and blacks stayed apart. And there were different unwritten rules for real estate agents, for different laws that would prevent different people from living together. And so segregation in the North seemed like prejudice was just as large there as it was in the South. Between 1916 and 1918, almost 500,000 blacks moved to the cities of the Northeast and Midwest to fill jobs and seeking social freedom. They worked in shipyards, steel mills, and meatpacking houses. Kind of talked about this. And the dislocation in housing and competition for jobs led to tensions between the races. This led to race riots in East St. Louis and other places. So during the war and after the war, African Americans served in segregated units. There were 2 race riots. East St. Louis in 1917 was the main one, and then there were 25 other smaller riots in the summer of 1919. Riots and labor violence blamed on immigrants. That it was immigrants that were taking all these African Americans who lived in the United States, who were part of the United States. The immigrants were the ones that were forcing them to act out, and that's why one of the reasons for the Immigration Act of 1924. While violence continued against blacks, lynchings increased from 1917 from 58 to over 70 by 1919. And some of these people that had lynching is an illegal hanging. Some of the African Americans lynched in 1919 were those in American uniform. They were veterans from World War I that were hung in their uniform because whites resented the fact that they were wearing U.S. uniforms, and they were afraid that African Americans would then start acting like they were the whites' equal. And so they were repressed through violence. A reporter in 1926 counted 140 churches in a 150-block section of Harlem, showing how many people were moving to the north. These were black churches, and just how, and the rise of also black culture. In the 1920s, saw the rise of black culture with the Harlem Renaissance. And just show that the economic condition of blacks changed very little from pre-war conditions. However, many of them were now living in cities rather than on plantations. Prohibition was another social impact. Before and during the war, temperance groups had worked to curb the intake of alcohol, seen as a major source of evil in society. Reaction to people's movement to the city and the loss of innocence people equated with World War I. There was this idea that the United States, after World War I, women were wearing shorter clothing. There was this idea of urbanization where women didn't have to have chaperones, and they considered it a loss of the American morals. And so one of the ways to regain that was prohibition, prohibiting alcohol. The Spanish flu, the epidemic, is seldom mentioned, and most Americans have apparently forgotten it. This is not surprising. The human mind always tries to expunge the intolerable from the memory, just as it tries to conceal it while current. Over 790,000 Americans died as the flu spread worldwide because soldiers infected each other from the front lines. Only 100,000 American soldiers died. It took out the young and might have been connected with why people wanted to forget this time period. So the analysis of the impact of World War I. Take time to go through and assess the impact World War I made on the foreign policy. And here's some questions that you will be asked later. Nice job on this, and we will continue looking at this over Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday.